to day 2 of Sea Level Rise Up. Thank you for spending part of your Saturday with us. My name is David Clement. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions, the main presenter of this conference, along with the Suncoast Sea Level Rise Collaborative, which exists under our umbrella. If you're just joining the conference today, a special welcome to newcomers, and I'm sorry you couldn't either get out of work or find a way to get here yesterday for day 1. You missed some outstanding presentations and discussions. For those returning, welcome back, and I hope your expectations were met with yesterday's speakers and program. The discussions brought out some surprising and inspiring ideas, and we captured some of the best quotes that we have shared on the screen this morning to set the stage for what you as members of the community can do. I especially liked one that was up there from Doug Marcy, our opening speaker from NOAA. He said, the more we learn, that is about sea level rise, climate change, the more uncertain we are, which is kind of a wry commentary on how hard this topic is, how hard our work is, but it should not prevent us from continuing. Indeed, it's a reason to continue. Yesterday, we opened with an analysis of the 4th National Climate Assessments by Mr. Marcy, and especially what it says about the Tampa Bay region. Today's opening speaker will give us a brief overview of that assessment and then give you some helpful tips on how to use it to retrieve data from it. Providing that perspective is Maya Burke, Science Policy Coordinator with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. Maya has spent more than 10 years working in water resource project management, regulatory compliance, land acquisition, and environmental land use planning for the Southwest Florida Water Management District and Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. She has also worked with a number of other environmental groups serving Tampa Bay, and by the way, she was a key planner of this conference. Please welcome Maya Burke.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. Today, I'm going to talk to you about demystifying the National Climate Assessment. Some of you are familiar with the National Climate Assessment itself, and some of you may have science backgrounds, and so this information might not be overwhelming. But many of you are citizens, and sometimes as we wade into scientific information, it can be overwhelming and scary even. And so my work here today is to talk to you about why it doesn't need to be scary, how you too can read the National Climate Assessment and you can share this information with your friends, family, and neighbors. This talk is one that's a little bit different from me. I work for the local National Estuary Program for Tampa Bay. And so oftentimes when I'm invited to these sorts of things, I get to talk about the local impacts and the scientific research that we're doing on the ground to measure climate change locally. I'll try and weave some of that information in, but really this talk is intended to be a little bit more of a meta-level talk about the relationship between scientific literacy and civic engagement. That's really the mission of the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions, and it's something that is of interest to me and has been since my work back in college. So I'm honored to be able to talk to you all today about those things. And then I just want to be able to give you some tips to how to effectively dispel misinformation that you might encounter in your conversations with your peers, specifically through storytelling and local examples. Giving you my notes aren't showing up here. Sorry. I will wing it if they can't get the presenter notes. I just like to have some of the reminders of things I definitely want to talk about. But the basic idea is that since we've had democracies throughout the world, this idea of science is very important to how you engage as citizens. Science literacy is something that's really key for how you process information and are able to effectively engage with the policy proposals that are put out there. And it's important that citizens be able to develop the key habits of mind that allow them to process information in a critical and sometimes skeptical way. Here we go. It looks different on my screen now. So we really want you all to be able, you don't have to be geologists or physicists or experts, but you should be comfortable analyzing information, assessing the sources of that information, how to ask good questions, and how to identify patterns in data. And those are some things that we need to do better on as a society through our K through 12 and graduate and postgraduate education programs. But it's something that never stops. We can always do better at honing these skills to become better citizens and better processors of information. So today, still not right. So today, the idea is I want to arm you with the Baloney Detection Kit. And this is a reference from John Morales yesterday. He talked about Carl Sagan and Carl Sagan's work, Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. And really the idea behind that is these sort of key principles of fallacies that we might fall into the trap of and how we talk with our friends and our families about scientific information, and the ways and the kinds of questions that we should be asking to identify whether or not somebody is kind of hosing us or trying to snow us. And the sort of abbreviated version that I'd like to talk about today is the mnemonic device that I'm going to offer you all is don't be a sap. Always make sure that you're evaluating the sources, the author, and the purpose. And we'll use the National Climate Assessment to sort of practice some of these skills later in my talk as an example of what I mean when I talk about the don't be a sap. So for sure, the science matters. What's in the National Climate Assessment matters. But what you do with it also matters. And talking about science and climate change really does help. Yesterday, Kelly Hammer-Levy from Pinellas County shared with us results from the Pinellas County Citizen Survey that showed how, as we've been talking about sea level rise more in the community over time, we've seen that this is an issue that's become more and more important to our neighbors. So here are the results that she was referencing. Just, it's an issue that's coming to the forefront of people's concern, and there are fewer and fewer people that are not concerned about climate change. Just last year, in 2018, almost a quarter of the residents of Pinellas County weren't concerned with sea level rise at all, and in 2019, that number, the results dropped down to 5% of your neighbors. And so that's really important, and what that tells us is that you are important in terms of how we can move the needle on climate change just by feeling comfortable and confident talking about climate change and the science behind it. But I do want to give a caveat. Having the data isn't enough. We have this idea that if we just go out and tell people all the things that we know, they'll take that information and make the right choices and do the right things just as we hope that they would. There's been a lot of social science research that shows that this isn't enough. It's called the deficit model, and that understanding of the relationship between how people learn and what they do with that information just doesn't function the way that we think that it does. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how values are also really important in how people process information and then translate it into action. And we'll hear from several panels that talk about what's some examples of things that the community might value that you might not be thinking about all the time. So for example, we'll have a panel discussion on real estate values, property values, mortgage banking, and insurance. These are things that may or may not be moving to you, but are very important to a large segment of the community community, and it's important to be thinking about those things that they might value and frame the conversation in ways that are meaningful to them. It's really these attitudes, beliefs, those sorts of things that are driving behavior change. And so being cognizant of that and meeting people where they're at is really key in how to make change in terms of climate. So it's not just about correcting and arguing with people, right? So part of the reason that the deficit model doesn't work is that if you correct people and if you're not careful about how you approach them, you can have what we call the backfire effect. There's social science research that demonstrates that when you correct someone, it might not actually do what you think. It's not reducing their misperceptions of the facts. It might, in fact, increase them. So if you say, well, actually, when someone tells you something that you think is not true or correct, a lot of times what folks do is they dig their heels in, right? And they become defensive. So they're busy building up the argument for why their position is correct, and they're not hearing you when you are trying to fight with facts. So facts are important, but they're really just not everything. How you say and what you say matters. Really, so much of this comes down to trust. That's what's important for democracy, and it's important for science communication, too. You need to know your audience. You need to meet them where they're at. You need to use trusted messengers. If it's not you, you need to find someone that you think your audience will trust and let them, give them the space to have that communication in a way that someone might be open and amenable to hearing. You need to reach out to people on a personal level. That's why you are so important in all of this. Hopefully, we'll hear some great insights today from our panelists later and our keynote speaker on some techniques and some of these things that might be moving for folks. And also, where possible, focus on solutions. But again, know your audience. Make sure that the solutions that you're talking about, in their mind, aren't worse than the problem itself. Oftentimes, we have ideas about solutions, but they might be totally unacceptable to someone who has a different ideology or a different political persuasion than you do. Work hard to meet them and find places where you can agree on what solutions will help us address this problem of our generation and our time. This idea of fake news and how to combat mistruths and fake information is something that's been a hot topic of conversation lately. Pew put out a really great study. Some of you might have heard or be familiar with the 6 Americas work that the Yale Climate Communications Group has put out on climate change. Well, Pew put out 5 Americas, and it has to do with segmenting the U.S. population and how we receive and perceive data and information sources. And one of the things that I thought was really helpful from this study is, there are groups of folks that are eager and willing. There are people that are confident and comfortable with data, but there are a lot of people that are cautious and curious, doubtful, or even wary of information. And where that information comes from, that idea about a trusted messenger, matters to them. So there's some troubling information here. For me, I work for a governmental partnership, and I'm a public employee. So these numbers about the distrust for government sources of information is something that I think is troubling for me and should be troubling for many of us when we don't trust our government in terms of the information that they're providing. But there's also and for the news media that was here yesterday, they're also not doing so well with some of those segments. People aren't trusting them. But I think that the opportunity that this highlights is that across the board, folks trust their family and friends. So your civic responsibility to inform yourself and then know how to effectively engage with your peers is really important, because that trust that you've built within your community is really one of the best ways we can get out information about climate change and make a difference in our world. So yesterday, we asked you about what inspires you to take action. That was one of the key questions that we asked the folks that were in the room yesterday. And today, I'm telling you that it's not just facts. So the best research says that it's really probably narratives. Narratives are persuasion. Those are the means that we have to persuade people. And really, a lot of this conversation is about how do we convince people that climate change is important, it's real, and we need to do something about it. So today, I'm going to give you a teaser about how storytelling is that tool. And then during our lunch keynote, Dr. Joanna Huckster will be talking more about giving you some of the tips and tools of how to apply this in your day-to-day life. But really, the UF School of Journalism is one of the leaders in this effort. They've done a lot of research showing the science of how to tell good and effective stories, and they've identified these 5 key principles for communicating effectively. And it involves a lot of these principles that I've been talking about today: joining the community, being part of a community, immersing yourself, meeting people where they're at. Communicate in images. Invoke emotion, but with intention. Be specific about the type of emotion. It has to do with knowing your audience and not just overwhelming people with fear or cloying kind of images or things like that. Be specific and strategic about it. Create meaningful calls to action. People need to understand what you're asking them to do, and it has to be moving. And then tell better stories. And like I said, we'll talk a little bit about what those look like. But first, I want to walk you through putting our Baloney Detection Kit test to the test. So I want to use this to explain why the National Climate Assessment is a great tool and a good information source for talking about climate change. So I want to start with a sort of a high-level view. I don't want to reiterate everything that Doug Marcy went over yesterday. His presentation was excellent. He gave examples not just from the Tampa Bay area or from Florida, but all throughout the Southeast. Really great. I encourage you to check out the recording of his presentation if you are unable to get it. But really just wanted to kind of take a step back. Some of you are familiar with the National Climate Assessment. Some of you might not. It's very large. There's a lot to read there. But really what you need to know is that there's 2 parts. Volume 1 is the Climate Science Special Report. And you can see here it has 15 chapters about different physical phenomena and climate stressors that are going on. And each of these chapters is essentially a literature review of the best available science that's agreed upon in the scientific community, that has been thoroughly vetted through the scientific process and scientific method. And it's summarized in a way that's fairly accessible, probably not to the 5th grade level that Jessica Mazzaros asked us to summarize it to, but it is pretty accessible. And then the second volume focuses on some of these more broad topics, the national topics of interest like water supply, energy, forests, coastal effects, those sorts of things. And then it also talks about regionally specific concerns. And then finally, it ends by addressing some of the adaptation actions that we might take to reduce the challenges that we feel as a result of a changing climate, and then how we can mitigate those changes through emissions reductions. So is this good information? Our Baloney Detection Kit asks us first to think about the sources. So the National Climate Assessment is required to meet the federal government standards for quality information, the Quality Information Act. And that means that every single piece of information that is in this report has to be useful, it has to be transparent, traceable, and reproducible, it has to be objective, it has to be it has to have data integrity, and it has to be secure, so not able to be manipulated. All of these things are the principles that you should be looking for in any type of report that you're talking about, you're referencing when you are talking to your peers, your friends, your family, your neighbors about climate change. It doesn't have to be the National Climate Assessment, but it should adhere to these types of principles, which the National Climate Assessment certainly does. What about the author? I'm not encouraging you to make ad hominem attacks, or I'm not saying that the National Climate Assessment, the authorship, is something that you should listen to because it comes from the government. That's not what's important here. What I'm asking you to think about when you're evaluating the author of a report is, are they an expert? Are they engaged in the scientific process, in the scientific method? And for the National Climate Assessment, they certainly are. Over 300 federal and non-federal experts are contributing to the National Climate Assessment. That's a very broad base of support of people who are coming to consensus on the best data that's out there, and that is something that we should respect. They also have taken this out to the public in numerous regional engagement workshops, reaching more than 1,000 members of the interested public. And it's been to both peer review, public review, and policymaker review. That is a thorough process that tells us that the authors should be respected and that the information that they're giving is quality. Finally, I'm asking you to assess the purpose of the National Climate Assessment. Is the National Climate Assessment trying to sell us something? Is it trying to convince us of something? The answer is no. The National Climate Assessment is done because it's statutorily required to. In the Reagan administration, the ball was set in motion to establish the U.S. Global Change Research Program. And then during the George H.W. Bush administration, Congress required the Global Change Research Act. So every 4 years, the executive branch is required to provide an assessment of the state of climate science to the country. And that assessment is supposed to summarize the likely effects, uncertainties, and trends in global climate change. So the answer is, the purpose of this document is to meet a federal requirement and to inform policymakers and the public about the threats that we face. These are compelling reasons to trust this information. So, the National Climate Assessment passes our Baloney Detection Kit. This is quality information. So that's an example of how to walk you through the process of thinking and assessing this information, but it's the same process that you can apply to any data source that you might encounter when thinking about climate change. The National Climate Assessment is trustworthy, it's neutral, and it's somewhat accessible for the lay audience. Other examples of places you might go for quality work would be the National Academy of Sciences or the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, your local universities, these types of things. One of the really great things that I like, and this is sort of an aside about the National Climate Assessment, is they provide some tips and tools of how to assess confidence and likelihood. So what I think this is really useful for, in terms of not only can you better assess the risks that they talk about in the climate assessment, but it also helps you be mindful of things like confirmation bias and the things that maybe you're predisposed to believe in, that you might be passionate about, that might lead you to be talking and perpetuating some of the extreme scenarios that are out there, and help you provide some objective distance in how you talk to others about things. It's really best to highlight the phenomena where we have both high confidence that they will occur, and something that's very likely and known to occur. And so this is a great tool. So back to storytelling and what you can do to get this information from the National Climate Assessment out there. Let's practice putting these 5 principles into action. So yesterday, Doug Marcy he summarized some of the key messages from the National Climate Assessment from the Southeast chapter. So I'm going to highlight 2 and walk through them real quickly with some of the things that I think about when I talk to folks about climate change here locally. The first one is natural ecosystems will be transformed. So this is an ungenerous characterization because the National Climate Assessment actually does a pretty nice job giving examples. But it's tempting for us when we talk to people to say, let's give them the data. Here's the chart that they have in the National Climate Assessment. So the chart that's relevant for us here is that we're not seeing as much cold weather, we're not seeing as many freezes, and so one of the things that's happening is it's not knocking back mangroves. So mangroves are encroaching in our marshes in particular. So we're seeing an increase in the number of mangrove ecosystems here in Tampa Bay. How can we tell that story better? People don't tend to respond to those kinds of dot graphs of freeze events. So let's tell a story. Let's keep it local. This is a picture from Fort DeSoto that you can see the mangroves literally walking in and encroaching on an area with marsh. It's experiential. It's something Kathleen Finnerty, who goes out to Fort DeSoto all the time, took this picture. She saw it happening. It's really great. We can talk about our experience. You don't have to be a scientist to see this, to have experienced it, and to share it in a way that's meaningful and powerful for people. It's also something that's easy to tie into things that are meaningful for your peers. What's important to you? Is it things like fishing? I mean, not everybody cares about mangroves, let's be honest, but a lot of our community is built on being out on the bay, fishing. Those are things that matter. We can talk about that, and we can make a connection to mangroves and marshes and what that means in a way that speaks to folks. And how do we tell good stories? The story that I always tell about this is I commuted down to Sarasota for a large part of my college life and then my early career. And I drove on 275 every day over the Manatee River. And for a 10-year time period, I can tell you, I have seen that the Juncus Marsh in the Manatee River go away. It's getting totally outcompeted by mangroves. I've seen that. I can tell you that story. That's probably more compelling and something that you all will remember more than me showing you a lot of maps of where we've lost Juncus Marsh, where mangroves are taking over. It might be harder for you to translate that to someone, but I'm telling you a story about how I've witnessed and experienced it. And maybe you have too. Maybe you've driven over that bridge. Maybe the next time you'll go and you'll look at that and you'll see, she's right. There's a lot of mangroves there. Something is going on. I also want to talk a little bit about sea level rise. This is the Sea Level Rise Collaborative, increasing flood risks in coastal and low-lying regions. So a lot of times, this is how we talk to you about it. We show you the projection curves. And then everybody wants to know, what curve are we on? What does this mean? Is it going to be 8 feet? Is it going to be 1 foot? And we have a lot of these conversations then that aren't very productive, right? So how can we communicate in images? This is a picture that I took right outside of my office in Bayboro Harbor. This is, again, sunny day in St. Pete. This is the bay coming up through storm drains. That's all it is. High tide, king tide, something I saw. I think it's pretty powerful. When I talk to people about sea level rise, the other thing that I like to show them is this picture right here. This is the tide gauge where we measure sea level change here in St. Petersburg. This is at the College of Marine Science, kind of downtown by the Dali Museum. So this isn't some Fed telling us what kind of sea level rise in that chart. It's measured, it's here in our backyard. Many of you might have been out on that peninsula, might have seen it. It's another thing to sort of bring it home and remind people that this research is happening here locally where we're at. Finally, this is how I usually end climate talks, but I'm learning a little bit. So this is my son a number of years ago, hanging out in the mangroves. He's why I do a lot of this, so it's something that's compelling for me. I care about him and the Florida that he's going to see. I know I've seen a lot of changes in my lifetime, and I'm concerned about the changes he's going to see. But social science actually tells us that maybe for a lot of you in the room, this is something that's compelling. But for many people who maybe think differently than we do, the idea of personal legacy is more important to them. And so future generations isn't something that is as exciting or something that's likely to convince them and have them change what they're doing and act on climate. But this idea of personal legacy is important. And so the thought that I'm leaving you with today is, what's your personal legacy on climate change? You have a chance to be a hero simply by talking to your neighbors often about climate. And so I hope that you do that. Are there any questions? Do we have time for questions? No? I think maybe we'll have time for questions at the end. So our next panel is going to talk about some of those values that I alluded to earlier, and it's going to be moderated by the Mayor Minning, Treasure Island, who's also one of the co-chairs of the Suncoast Sea Level Rise Collaborative. Mayor Minning.